Hi Zoe.
Hi Tom,
How
how
are
are
you?
you?
Good, thank you. Fine.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So today I'm with Zoe Johnson. We've been close friends for more than 30 years. Zoe is one of Britain's most accomplished criminal law barristers. She's a QC and she's only the second woman ever to be appointed Senior Treasury Counsel. For those of you not familiar with the term, the Senior Treasury Counsel is appointed by the Attorney General in Britain to prosecute the most serious cases, the most serious criminal cases in the country. So you have Islamic terrorism, homicide, organized crime, abuse of public office, so-called honor killings, and such other very important matters. And I know that Zoe doesn't want to be judged or defined by this, but she's done all this with the added difficulty of being confined to a wheelchair for almost all her life, having been in hospital for much of her childhood between the ages of 4 and 13 as a result of having spina bifida. So Zoe, we're still sort of in the coronavirus period. How's the lockdown been for you?
Well, I have to admit, Tom, that it hasn't been so bad for two reasons. I'm just incredibly lucky because I live in Oxfordshire and have the benefit of a lovely garden and quite a few animals. And also, unlike most barristers who rely on being in court every day, I'm actually preparing a case for the Court of Appeal next year. And so I've been able to work from home, spending sort of far too many hours on Zoom and Teams.
And in fact, I should point out that in addition to the fine library behind you, I have had lunch in your lovely garden. So it is a beautiful garden. I hope you're able to pop out for breaks in the fresh summer air.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I can't imagine what it must be like being stuck in a flat without even a balcony. We're just very, very lucky.
yeah. So Zoe, let's go back to the beginning. I mentioned already that it's obviously, at least in some ways, a difficult childhood. But tell me a little bit about your upbringing, your parents, and so
on. Okay, so I was born in Poole, which is a coastal town in on the south coast. And both my parents were teachers, which was an enormous benefit because they supported me and my sister and pushed us. I went to the local comprehensive school in Dorset, which was not quite so supportive.
Just to explain to international viewers, comprehensive school is the sort of not so, well, the opposite of the privileged public schools or private schools. It's a much harder education or less privileged.
It's a state school, yeah.
A state school, but also not a grammar school. So it's a tougher school, let's say. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
It's non-selective. And although I had one or two good teachers, there was no desire to push children. There were no real aspirations to get to the top. So when I applied for Oxford, and you just basically did it myself, I didn't have any support from my school, went off and did the exam on my own, in a little room. And when I was lucky enough to get a place, instead of the school saying, hurrah, this is our first pupil to get to Oxford or Cambridge, the response from the headmaster was, what was wrong with Bristol? So it was a classic sort of rather chippy, lower denominator sort of approach, which was a shame, but I hope things have changed a bit.
And of course, I remember we met first at Oxford, and I think you were probably the only person in a wheelchair at least among students at that time anyway, I think, in university.
I may well have been, yeah. I certainly don't remember anyone else. So that at least gave me the advantage of being unique.
But Zoe, let's just go back a second, because as I mentioned at the beginning, you were in and out of hospital from the age of 4 to 13. So it's not just that you were the only person from your school to get to Oxford. It can't have been easy. You must have missed a lot of school, and it must have been hard, not being able to play with other kids so much if you're in hospital a lot. I mean, that must have
I mean, I did miss out a lot of schooling, and that certainly That certainly told when it came to my maths O-level results. But the great thing about being in hospital was that I had masses of time to read, and that's how I occupied myself. I just read and read and read, and I think later on that was actually quite helpful for me. I got that huge body of literature, as it were, that I'd already read and absorbed, which was, great, because I went on to read English literature at university.
Yeah. In fact, by sort of coincidence, I guess, we later discovered that you were at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital in London at the same time as a very close family friend of mine, Archie Thomas, who was ill from the age of 5 and tragically died age 16. And of course, I remember Archie was very, very sweet, very well. So that is a kind of coincidence that you were basically hospitalized with him for much of that period.
Yeah, we ended up in the same ward. I mean, I was only 5 years old. I do remember Archie's parents, Mike and Jane, but what was quite extraordinary is move the clock forward to the age of 18, and I ended up going to the same college as Archie's sister, Emily, who has become one of mine, and I know yours because you knew her forever, greatest friends. And so that was an extraordinary coincidence.
Yes, yes. And it's nice in a way to continue the memory of Archie somehow in this way. But I also know, because you've mentioned it before, that your own father, who was quite a bit older than your mother, he passed away when you were age 13. So, I mean, maybe, I would say you had quite a difficult childhood, it sounds like to me.
Well, yeah, age 13 was not a great year for me, because that was the year my dad died, and that was the year I ended up going into a wheelchair for life. And of course, a young girl at the age of 13, it's quite a sort of transitional period. But I don't think of it as a hard childhood, because I had such wonderful parents, albeit I lost, I actually lost both of them quite early, and a very, very happy and supportive home, and my lovely sister, and we are incredibly close. So I think compared with a lot of people that you've interviewed, Tom, I didn't have it so bad.
Well, anyway, you're always in a positive mood and always look on the best things, although maybe not when you're dealing with those cases I just mentioned, and we'll come to them in a moment. But just tell me, when you let's just talk about studying English for a moment. Is there any particular memories, or do you have favorite authors in general, maybe ones you studied or indeed ones you just read by yourself?
Well, when I was at Oxford, you do such a spectrum of authors, albeit in those days everything sort of finished in about 1950. But T.S. Eliot has always been in a great favourite of mine, and I was very lucky to be taught by Dr. Lyndall Gordon, who was one of my tutors, and she's one of the experts on T.S. Eliot, also on Virginia Woolf, who is another favourite. But I had, for everything from Chaucer through to Hemingway, lots of favourites. But the one thing that was not a favourite was having to do 1 year of Anglo-Saxon literature. I was quite pleased when I could give that one up.
Yeah. So why did you? I remember you told me once that you were thinking of going to even become a theatre director, but in the end you chose to become a criminal barrister, a criminal lawyer. Why? What made you choose that?
Well, I got to my third term of my third year, and thought, oh my goodness, I'm about to leave university. What am I going to do? And it was a toss-up, as you say, between being a theatre director, because I'd done a lot of that at Oxford, or being a criminal barrister. Now, I had no law in my family. Nobody had been involved in the law. And it was a rather whimsical decision, but I always regarded it as I call it, legitimate voyeurism. It's rather like reading a wonderful novel, a great Dostoevsky. You have this intimate relationship, not with the characters on the page, but with the characters in the case. And it is a privilege to have insight into so many different types of existence. and the best of humankind and the worst of humankind. And so for me, it was a natural development from being from having studied literature.
Because of course you've done, you were a defence barrister, defence lawyer for much of your career before you got appointed by the Attorney General to be a sort of prosecutor on behalf of the British government. But you know, just tell, I mean, you've done so many cases, but for example, I remember you once mentioned one about a mother who suffocated her 3 disabled children to death. I mean, it must be so difficult. Which side were you on in that case, actually?
That was when I was in Treasury Counsel, as a member of the Treasury Counsel team, so I was prosecuting that case, but it was an extremely upsetting case for everybody involved. And my decision, which was a carefully weighed decision, taken by me, but also by other members of the team, was whether or not to accept a plea to diminished responsibility. So rather than being a murder, it was reduced to a manslaughter. And so that required an enormous amount of time investigating the woman's mental health and really drilling down into the psychiatric evidence. And that's what I decided to do. That was the right thing to do, that she was severely depressed at the time. Because it was, go on.
Murder, as far as I know, in Britain, carries an automatic life sentence.
Yes.
And tell us, if you don't mind, how old were her children? I mean, that she strangled to death.
I can't now remember their precise ages, but they were all under about the age of 10. So they were young.
They were severely disabled?
They were severely disabled. It was tragic on every level. And what was also quite interesting is that it got a lot of press attention. And obviously my name appeared because I was prosecuting it. But of course, the people who read the newspaper reports didn't realize that I'm in a wheelchair. And what was very interesting is I got a lot of hate mail after that case. You know, why did you accept this plea? Why didn't you push for murder? This is a disgrace. You've got no idea about disabled rights and all the rest of it, which was slightly ironic given my situation. But yeah, these cases are hugely sensitive, and that was perhaps one of the worst.
Sort of terrorism, Islamic terrorism cases as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I've done a range of those cases. So I was involved in the first terrorist fundraising case. Also, conspiracy to cause explosives, a man who had converted to radical Islam and was planning a series of bombs in Bristol. Fortunately, he was apprehended before that happened. And those are, again, difficult cases for a whole host of other reasons, not least because there's an awful lot in the background. And sometimes that cannot be put before a court because it's so sensitive. So the involvement of the secret services and aspects of the police force. And so as a prosecutor, it's your job to ensure the balance between everybody getting a fair trial, but important state secrets or state methodology needing to be preserved. And that is, again, a very, very difficult balance. And of course, when you're having a dialogue with the security services, which a lot of these cases involve, there's a tension because my sole raison d'etre is to ensure there is a fair trial. And that means there are lots of legal obligations on disclosure and things like that. Whereas organs of the state, they have competing interests. And so that sets up quite difficult balance. And in one case, one Islamic case, I actually took the decision that I could not prosecute this case because I was not being permitted to reveal something which I felt was critical for a fair trial. And so in the end, the prosecution was stopped. So those are, you know, very,
I mean,
very difficult, but, you know, balancing acts.
often, I guess, the secret services or the state doesn't want to potentially reveal the identity of informers or undercover agents or this kind of thing. So it is obviously difficult. I mean, there's another high-profile case I know you maybe were an advisor on, and it's been in the papers, and it involves obviously America too, is the case of Gary McKinnon, who hacked into NASA and into the Pentagon, the US Department of Defense. Were I right in thinking you were involved in that?
Yes, I was involved in an advisory capacity in that case, yes.
That was quite recent, a year or two ago, right? I think.
A few years ago. I mean, it was, as you know, it went through the courts in this country. It took quite a long time, and in the end, he was not extradited to America. And again, that is interesting because you're dealing with a wholly different legal system, and the impact of their legal system, the possible penalty that he would have received, and whether that is considered lawful in this country, and so on and so forth. So, you know, again, those multi-jurisdictional cases are interesting. They're very interesting because the American system is so very different to our own.
And there was also, I think, some precedent you were involved with in Britain to do with female genital mutilation. What remind us about?
Yes, well, that's a controversial area. And there's been a law in this country since 1985, but there's never been a prosecution. And then, I can't remember how long it was ago, now about 3 years.
Prosecution of someone carrying out female genital mutilation.
Carrying out female or assisting in female genital mutilation. And there was a lot of pressure on by the politicians for the Crown Prosecution Service, who are the body in this country who prosecute, to bring a prosecution under that law. And I defended in the first case, and it was unfortunately the wrong case to bring, because it is a appalling and dreadful thing, female genital mutilation, that goes without saying. But this prosecution was of a doctor, an NHS doctor, who actually had to make an incision in a woman to ensure the safe delivery of her child during labour. And if ever there was the wrong case, I'm afraid it was that one, and he was gloriously and quite rightly acquitted, because what he did was necessary as a surgical procedure. It was not female genital mutilation as perhaps most people understand it.
Yeah. And
that was a great example of the jury system in this country working so well, and saying, no, this is not what this is law is intended for.
Yeah. Zoe, I remember we were having a chat earlier in the coronavirus pandemic lockdown crisis, and you were mentioning that the governing authorities in Britain were taking advantage of the sort of lockdown or pandemic to pursue their own agenda with the criminal justice system. And I know that in many countries, various governments have been accused of exploiting the crisis for their own authoritarian ends. What particularly is the case in Britain?
Well, those of us who are involved in the criminal justice system are very anxious indeed. There was a backlog of cases before COVID-19, a dreadful backlog, because the government was not prepared to put the necessary money into the system. So we had a lot of courts that were shut, judges put on what's called gardening leave, and this has been going on for years. And so the backlog was pretty bad before this crisis. Now, if I tell you, as a result of that and the virus, the backlog in the Crown courts, because in this country, as you know, Tom, the more minor cases go to the magistrates court, but the more serious cases, this is a massive generalization, but the more serious cases go to the Crown court. As of now, the backlog in the Crown court is something like 42,000 cases. The backlog overall is over 500,000 cases. And that's going to take at least 10 years to clear. the government is being pushed on this, and their innate reaction, which I hope we have persuaded them to pull back from, was to get rid of the jury system for a period of time, which would be a fundamental erosion of our rights.
Why do they want to do that? Because they think it will be quicker.
Because it's quicker. It's quicker to have a judge-only trial. Yeah. So that's an example of where we, as a group of people involved in this work, are very anxious that we do not allow the government to use this as a way of eroding our rights. Because the fear is that once they've done that for 6 months, what's to stop them, whatever they say, doing it for 6 years? And it's a real concern, not only for barristers, but lawyers, but much more importantly for defendants, victims, witnesses, everybody.
By the way, talking of the interaction between law and the authorities or politics, I'll just fill people in case they don't know. So in Britain, it's essentially a two-party system. There's a governing Conservative Party, which has been in power for a long time, now under Boris Johnson. But the Labour Party, the main opposition party, lost very badly in an election a few months ago when their leader was a radical figure, Jeremy Corbyn. The Labour Party now have a much more moderate figure, Keir Starmer, who has already sort of brought back a certain degree of public trust, or more mainstream public trust in the Labour Party. And Keir Starmer, you know him, he had a legal career most of his career, but now he's a politician. So he was Director of Public Prosecutions, wasn't he? So tell me a bit about your dealings with him in the past. And let me ask you, do you think, I know that you're actually supported the Lib Democrats, which is a third smaller party, but do you think Keir Starmer, from what you know of him, would make a good Prime Minister? And what was he like?
Well, Tom, if we had a general election now, I would be voting Labour under Keir Starmer. I wouldn't be voting Liberal Democrats because I'm afraid they're in a bit of a mess right now, in my humble opinion.
I don't think many people will be voting for them. But
no, I fear not. No, Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions, and so I had some dealings with him in that capacity. He was an extremely good DPP. He came from a background of being predominantly a defence barrister, so he is a very fair-minded man who, as we may have, those of us who've looked at Prime Minister's Question Time, for example, there's a real contrast now between Boris, who is all showmanship but not very much detail, and Keir, who is an absolute master of his brief. And that is the art of being a successful lawyer. You have to know your brief inside out, back to front. And he knows his, his brief every time he comes to the dispatch box. And the contrast is astonishing. So I think he's got a very difficult role, but from everything I know about him and of him, I think he will be very successful, and I think he will occupy that centre-left ground, which is what a lot of people in this country want back.
I'm not sure if it's just centre-left. I would say centre in general, in the sense that he's, both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn were rather, pushed possibly. They either pushed their parties to the extremes or their parties pushed them or whatever. And Keir Starmer is certainly closer to the centre and is more calm and so on. And if I might point out, from what I understand, unlike Jeremy Corbyn, a radical left figure who actually had a rather privileged upbringing, and Boris Johnson, who had a very privileged upbringing, Keir Starmer is from fairly humble roots. He's a self-made person, possibly a little bit like yourself, that he's worked his way up through intelligence and hard work and level-headedness.
He's a good guy.
Yeah. Anyway, Zoe, I wouldn't want people to think you're just all about the law, because I know that you're a fantastic traveller all around the world, and you certainly haven't let the fact you're in a wheelchair stop you travelling all over the place. And I've had the privilege of meeting you in Prague in the Czech Republic and in Jerusalem and Israel, two cities Prague has old town, and Jerusalem has an old city. There are a lot of cobblestones in both those places, and I have accompanied you around in your wheelchair, and that did not stop you for 1 second going down the Via Dolorosa or whatever it was in Jerusalem.
Yeah, it probably ruined your back, Tom, but yeah.
I hardly need to push you, Zoe. I had to chase after you. Anyway, but I know that you went more recently. That was a long time ago, but I know you went more recently. You were in India. You were in, was it Borneo? Where have you been? Tell us some of the more adventurous.
Well, my last big trip was to Mexico just before lockdown, which was a fabulous trip. Particularly going to all the old Mayan sites. There were one or two of those that defeated me because they were really quite out of the way and rocky, but not many. But most of my travel over the last 10 years has been east, actually. There's a real pull, various family reasons, and also my husband's family reasons. So we've been we've been to India 5 times, Myanmar, and all sorts of places in Southeast Asia. The next big place I really want to travel to is Japan, but it's very interesting actually, because you can tell quite a bit about a country in terms of the way they react to somebody who is obviously disabled. And in the main, I've had huge amounts of help and support. One of the most memorable occasions was when I was in Laos, and we were on a boat coming down the Mekong River, and we were stopping at a lodge for one night. And my husband nearly had a heart attack when we moored, because there were 100 steps from the boat to the lodge, and he was thinking, God, this is too much. But there were 4 Laotian men who were there waiting for me with a homemade sedan chair, and I was carried up like the Queen of Sheba up 100 steps, with everybody clapping behind. Okay. And at the end, obviously, I wanted to give them some money to say thank you. No, they wouldn't have anything to do with it, and they said, we just want you to enjoy our country. And you know, it's noticeable that in some of the poorest countries, that feeling of wanting to make you feel welcome, that sense of hospitality, it is overwhelming actually. So yeah, I mean, I've had 1 or 2 occasions when I've been refused entrance into religious buildings because I'm in a wheelchair, and therefore my wheels might be a bit dirty, and there are some very strict views about that. And there's a part of me that wants to argue, but then I step back and say, no, perhaps you could just let me sit here and I'll just look, and So we come to a compromise. But it was interesting actually, because 2 years ago I was in Oman, and there was no problem with me going into the great mosque there in Muscat, because although it was an extraordinary carpet and all the rest of it, they said, no, it's fine, just, you know, go. So different cultures, different attitudes.
In fact, one thing, you know, I'm sure Britain is good with wheelchair ramps and, you know, museums and all over the place. But I remember when you started your career as a lawyer, they didn't have wheelchair ramps in the court. And I think you had to basically kick up quite a fuss to make sure they were wheelchair accessible, the courts in Britain. Isn't that was right, I think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was quite a fight. And what's interesting and rather sad, and just sort of echoing what we were saying a moment ago about the way austerity has affected the criminal justice system, the buildings, the court buildings, the fabric, it is literally falling apart. And I mean that literally. I mean, a roof came down in a court in London onto people's heads. I mean, it's that bad. And so actually, the situation is worse now. I mean, I've been doing this job for 30 years than it was when I started, because there's no money to mend the lifts. There is only one court where I can sit as a judge. And even that's dodgy now because the lift keeps going out of action. So it's astonishing, actually, Tom, but it's worse now than it was 30 years ago.
Terrible.
I mean, the attitude's better, but the actual fabric and the physicality is not.
Yeah. Zoe, by the way, I was just thinking when you mentioned, you know, Mexico and Oman and Myanmar and all those places, that you really should write a travel book when you retire. Just, you know, I know you've always had a great love for literature, and I can see all those wonderful books behind you there. Have you also had time to read for pleasure during this coronavirus period? Is anything you're reading at the moment?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I think I, like a lot of people, when we thought we were going to have a bit more time on our hands, thought, you know, we would get through all the greats that have been piling up and we haven't read, but didn't quite work out like that. But what I have done is I went actually back to some old favorites. And it's interesting, actually, when you read something, having not picked it up for 30 years, one's attitude changes enormously. So I read the Men at Arms trilogy, Evil in War, which I'd read 2 of the 3 at university and loved it just as much now. And I think I appreciated the humor more now than I did then. But the reverse of that is I'm right now, I have to say, rather, this is Emily, our friend, is going to hate me for saying this, but I'm reading Middlemarch and I'm really struggling with it. And it's interesting because I read it as a student and I did enjoy it, but now I find I desire more economical language. Maybe that's the lawyer in me coming out. And so this Victorian, rather embellished language, I'm really not enjoying very much, but I am going to finish it.
I don't think it's just the lawyer in you. We're unfortunately or fortunately living in a much more speeded up environment where, through, you know, emails and text messages and WhatsApp and so on, everything's much shorter and tighter. Anyway, Zoe, I think we're probably out of time, but it's been really interesting, and I hope to actually see you in person soon. And
that would be nice, Tom. Yeah, really nice. Well, thank you so much, and let's hope we meet soon.
Okay, bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.